Hi there everyone, today I'm reviewing Emperor of Rome by Mary Beard. So in this book, renowned ancient historian, documentarian and writer Mary Beard takes a look at the Roman emperors and what the role really entailed. Atypically, it doesn't focus too much on their character, as she argues it is hard to really assess this in an accurate way. Although we do have a good few primary sources for the Roman emperors, often writers had incentives to portray them either favourably or critically. Beard notes how Suetonius had a habit of pairing bad, inverted commas, emperors with physical ailments, and good emperors happening to be very healthy. Emperors cared about their legacies, and often they invested huge amounts into this, such as Hadrian, who raised lots of statues and benevolent gifts to remind everyone of what he'd done and, basically to get people to love him, even posthumously. Perhaps critics knew the best way to get revenge on an emperor was to ensure everyone in the future would think of them as a madman, cruel, or physically ill. Kind of suggestive of their kind of lack of healthy vigour in life. This book is a generous tome then, dipping and jumping between different emperors from Augustus to Alexander Severus. Beard takes this as the last emperor covered to 235 CE in the book, arguing that what it took to be an emperor had shifted dramatically after this date, many often just becoming regional emperors, for example, despite their titles. In some ways, reading Emperor of Rome at least requires some prior knowledge. The different periods of Rome were quite different to one another, that when Constantine came in, the influence of Christianity wrought significant changes, the relationships between East and West Roman Empire, of course. But this book captures very well the essence of what the Roman emperor was expected to do and was able to actually achieve. As Beard acknowledges, the staggering size of the Roman empire, in many ways meant it was an impossible administrative task. And we don't really know how it always worked practically. Although Roman emperors took the credit, and sometimes the responsibility, for military victories, indicated by whom the triumphs were dedicated to, i.e. the emperor, there was also a delicate balance between the people, senate, and emperor. And although early on emperors like Tiberius, Caligula, or Nero seemed to get away with quite a lot, much later on emperors found themselves devoting ever-increasing amounts to their army from their treasury. And most famously, they had to make sure that the Praetorian Guard was kept on side, as they were a constant assassinatorial thorn in the emperor's side. One fear that the emperors always had was that their army would kind of mutiny against them and depose them. A big strength of this book is that it considers some of the more niche questions when it comes to emperors. I think it's fairly common that military relationships and actions, wealth, gladiatorial bouts are kind of considered and talked about, but Beard considers things that go a little deeper. For example, she mentions how the maze of the palace worked both as a protective method for the emperor if someone tried to kill him, but also left an emperor at the mercy of his slaves, servants, and family in the event of emergency. Probably not really knowing or spending enough time in the palace to know it off by heart, or specific escape routes. And what about travel abroad when he's not at the palace? How did emperors travel? How did important messages reach them whilst they were travelling the provinces? Or the portraits of emperors, which, clearly wanted to be portrayed in a certain way to kind of show this noble aspect, this sort of noble lineage. But what about when one province has deviated from the state-approved approach? And you can kind of imagine for emperors where their kind of inheritance was a bit more questionable, they really want to show themselves as, oh yes, I'm completely a noble, I deserve to be here and have this role. But then if a province starts kind of tarnishing that, showing features a little less favourably, what does that kind of mean? And what sort of happens? It was kind of noted that basically the empire sort of said, this, I think it was a Spanish province, I can't remember, but basically, fix this. We need to get them to show you in the light we want to show you, although they didn't say it as obviously as that. So as you can see, we really get into some of the smaller questions in this book. And I, for one, was glad that as another book in terms of top line information, I think it could have suffered from these kind of topics of, you know, an emperor, their military wars being covered so much, and kind of just bundling them all into a big book probably wouldn't work that well. So I really liked that Mary Beard asked some of the more difficult questions or things a bit more specific. The typical petty, self-absorbed characters of most of the Roman emperors does come out sometimes, even though this wasn't really a focus, as I mentioned earlier. The one part I never tire of reading is the cruelty of or madness of some of the emperors, and pondering where the kind of exaggerations are and where the actual facts lie. From shooting spectators to Caligula making his horse a general, most of the events you might already know are in here, and Beard tends to treat them in a balanced and, of course, knowledgeable way. Occasionally I didn't always agree with the interpretations, though. Beard notes how Marcus Aurelius' statue might be considered differently nowadays, where the barbarian is missing from underneath Marcus's raised horse hoof, ready to basically stamp on the barbarian, and the barbarian is kind of missing from that statue now. And although that is true, it kind of seems negligent to kind of focus on that in a way, because anyone who's read much about Rome would know how brutal, for example, Caesar's campaigns were, or how the Romans would have seen themselves as superior to any barbarian. So obviously, modern interpretation, we kind of frown upon that, but it was pretty normal in the day, and, you know, they sort of just thought themselves as superior to any enemy they would face. So it's not really that notable in a way, but I get Beard's point. She's kind of saying, well, look, nowadays we would kind of be a bit like, whoa, that's a bit harsh, but it's really not the perspective the Romans would have seen, I don't think. But overall, she tends to be very measured in her analysis and what she's sort of saying. So I think it does a good job overall. There's just sometimes I didn't always agree with the analysis or what was focused on. Some of the deviations are likely to be tedious for some as well, I think. And like I said, I kind of liked that she went into these niche topics, but I think some people might find it a bit boring. You know, we do actually learn a fair amount about the characters. I think she does a good job of not trying to say, look, Caligula was actually an idiot and he was mad and he did all these horrible things. She does a good job of not going down that path and just avoiding it, but instead just sort of talking about what's reported and what we think happened. But yeah, some sections or topics are bound to not appeal to everyone, because they'll be very specific. Some of the stuff like the contacting a Roman emperor whilst abroad, probably some people probably just don't care, right? Lastly, the production of the book and the audiobook are done really well. There's plenty of kind of like images in here, and the audiobook is read by Mary Beard herself, which is nice. But I would actually recommend getting the book in this instance because it's full of interesting pictures, art and detail, and it's often referred to in the text or audiobook. So if you're listening to the audiobook, you don't really want to like keep looking at the PDF because part of the reason is to just sit there and listen to it. But it kept going, oh, look at this in the PDF, and I was like, okay, I'm just going to read the library book instead. So yeah, effort went into the production, though. It's done really well, and I think it kind of deserves marks for that. Because sometimes I think a lot of books produced just don't really focus on the quality of what's being offered in almost like the hardware, inverted commas, whereas this has definitely been considered here. So in terms of final score, this is in many ways a kind of generalist book on the emperors of Rome, but Beard skillfully draws together many themes to make it an illuminating and interesting read. I think that despite its mass market appeal, there's actually still a lot in here for people that have read a lot about Rome and her emperors, so I think this is a really strong one. It's worth picking up. So I'm giving this one an 8 out of 10. And I'll be reviewing plenty more ancient history books. So like and subscribe for that, and thanks for watching.